Shalom, friends. We are here. I'm very excited to have with us a special guest, Shani Taragin, where we're going to be discussing the Israel Bible and Tanakh with Shani Taragin. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let me just tell you, if you're not familiar with Shani Taragin, so she is a graduate of Stern College and completed her bachelor's and master's degree in Tanakh and Talmud from Bar Ilan University. A very prolific speaker, speaks everywhere, teaches in dozens of schools and seminaries and yeshivas in Israel, and is also serves as the educational director for Mizrahi Olami. Very accomplished. She leads tours, and the best part about Shani, when I asked her to speak, and I said, "What is like your favorite topic?" And she said, "Well, anything in Tanakh is my favorite topic." So, thank you very much. But you were saying that you give tours, and when you give tours in Israel, what happens when you give tours?
So it's fascinating. I'd say there are two effects. Number one, the story in Tanakh truly comes to life because you're able to picture the setting. You see the scene, and even if there are houses or new buildings, the topography, the geography, the geology has remained the same, and therefore you're able to not just picture the scene, but the Tanakh story comes to life. But what's also fascinating is very often you'll go to a place and you'll see how the place helps you appreciate the story more. Just a quick example, when you go to Shiloh and you read the story at the beginning of Shmuel Aleph of how Shiloh, the Mishkan in Shiloh, is destroyed. So I love taking literally a measuring rope with me and showing my students how, oh my, we can figure out where the Mishkan was. But it's even more than that, because we don't understand how it could be that when they entered the city, Eli HaKohen, who was sitting by the Mishkan, doesn't yet hear about the cries of war. He doesn't hear about the terrible defeat by the hands of the Plishtim. But when you go on site, you realize that the entrance to the city is on the other side of where the Mishkan was. So all of a sudden, you're able to appreciate the text of Tanakh so much more. So it's both the story coming to life, and I would say the text receiving new meaning. And we have such a zchut today, really a tremendous privilege and a tremendous merit to be able to come back to our land and not only live in the land again, but live our past and our present and our futures together.
Beautiful, yeah. And living in Beit Shemesh, where there's so much Tanakh archaeology everywhere you turn, where David fought with Goliath, and we drive on that road all the time, and it's very...
And specifically Beit Shemesh, now with the new excavations opening, you have a magnificent city from the time of Shlomo, from the time of Shmuel. You can picture the Aron Kodesh coming back from the western coast by the hands of the Plishtim. And so it really, again, as you see, I become alive, but hopefully students, anyone who lives here is able to appreciate that as well.
And I'll just one more thing. So I also have a very beloved friend who's not Jewish. He's a pastor, and we have these conversations also on Zoom, and we talk about the Bible. And he was quoting something where he was like, when King David was hiding in the Adullam caves, and I said, we were just there yesterday. I took my kids there yesterday.
That's right. Again, it's our backyard, literally our backyard. I live in the backyard of the path that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob took, kind of going from the southern hills of Hebron all the way to Jerusalem. And that's literally my backyard, with a huge ritual bath, a huge mikvah, because that's the same path that we would take on our way to the temple in Jerusalem. So yes, indeed. And this is something that we can visit daily.
Yeah, and we can't take it for granted because we're really the first generation to be able to have this, and how blessed we are, how fortunate we are.
That's right.
Okay, now, so I asked you what should we speak about, and the list is very long, and so let's see how many things we could get through. I've heard some of your classes where you have a very beautiful perspective when it comes to the family of Moshe, the family of Moses, and not only his brother Aaron, who's very famous, but his sister Miriam. How is Miriam such a central figure for us today?
Beautiful. So firstly, I love speaking about the dynamics of the family relationships in Tanakh, not only because they certainly and herald various messages for us to extrapolate from those stories and to inculcate in our own family lives, but you get to see the dynamics, especially when it comes to Moshe's family, starting with his parents even, and certainly the sibling relationships, to marvel at a family of leadership. I say it's not just the dynamic duo of Moshe and Aaron, it's the triumvirate of Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. And this is recorded not only in the words of the Torah, but in the words of the Nevi'im, of the prophets. Right? Micha speaks about Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. And Miriam in particular, we find in various stories throughout, not only the book of Exodus, but throughout the book also of Bamidbar, throughout the book of Numbers. And in so many instances, it's about, she's introduced as part of this, really this dynamic of the sibling, and it's not rivalry, and as much as highlighting each one of these leaders that basically set the tone for all future leadership for the people of Israel. So whether we find both in the text itself and certainly woven into the words of the Midrash, where Moshe is more the, Moses is the man that brings us the word of God. Moses, our sages teach us, in his merit, we have the man, literally the leaven from heaven, and not teaching us the sustenance from God. And Aaron, and he's more the Ben Adam L'Chaveiro, he's the one who, albeit as a priest, as the high priest in the tabernacle, he's going to be the one engaged in the dynamics of society. And our sages once again teach that he's the one who is going to provide for the Anana or the Anane Kavo, the clouds of glory within the people of Israel. And Miriam, who is going to be not only a teacher, but also involved in the social dynamic and the prophetic leadership of the people of Israel. And you have to remember, this is pre, any feminist leadership, campaigns that we have on her own, both in the stories themselves and what we call the pshat, the stories of the Tanakh, and the Midrash, the words of the sages, the extrapolatory techniques to teach us various messages. Miriam appears as a prophetess and a true leader for the people, for which our sages once again say she's the one, if you look especially in the book of Numbers, in whose merit we have the Be'er, we have the wells of Miriam. And therefore, to develop these ideas, I think it's fascinating to see how the methodologies of a literary approach together with the midrashic approach of homiletics really are built off, right, of the text itself. And fascinating to see how she becomes not only a leader of the people in the realm of scholarship, but really a leader for the people in the realm of understanding the dynamic and the interplay between our physical health and our spiritual health. So much so that the first time that she's introduced to us, she's called an achot, the word that we're familiar with today, which isn't just a sister, but a nurse. She's one who provides water in every sense of the word, both the physical and the spiritual nourishment.
So we meet Miriam along the water. And then when she passes, when the Jewish people cross through the sea, so obviously she leads the women in song upon exiting the water. And then when she dies, it mentions also that they lost the well, or they ran out of water.
All of a sudden, there's no water. And that's beautiful that you said that, meaning that the first introduction, she's by the water, saving the life of baby Moses, saving the life of Moshe. So it's about waters of salvation. The second time, as you said, is by crossing Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. And once again, the salvation, this time on a national level. And it's not just that she leads them in song and dance. It says that she goes out and she basically is going to, I always say, it's more that she lifts her baton and everyone follows her. But hanashim achareha, that she is a true leadership who understands how to inspire people, not just to passively respond, but to be proactive. And that's also very unique about her leadership. And then we always skip to the story at the end of her life where there's no more water. And once again, it's a water story. But the truth is that there's another story in which she doesn't appear as a character, but her name is dominant. And that is right after the story of Yam Suf. The next story is the people come to a place called Mara, because the Mayim is Mar, the waters are bitter. And basically Miriam is, I'm even going to say, a subtle character. She's behind the scenes in that story as well, wherein God teaches us that we can transform bitter waters into waters of sweetness, and once again, health and survival by not just drinking waters, but by being provided with chok and mishpat, with statutes and with laws. So that very much is intertwined not only with her name, but her essence. And every story of Miriam is basically a water story or a health story, even the story not just at the time of her death, but when we hear her speaking about Moshe Rabbeinu, saying, we're also prophets, Miriam and Aaron, and she is going to be stricken with tzara'at, not really leprosy, but she turns completely white. And I believe that part of the reason for that punishment in particular is because she, like Moshe, she performs miracles with water, just like Moshe. She performs miracles, or Aaron performed miracles with serpents, just like Moshe. Both of them, though, couldn't perform the miracle of transferring their hand into tzara'at and then into healthy skin. And the story of Miriam teaches that you can transform yourself through the power of prayer that Moshe prays for her. And as she is, once again, albeit not in a story of water, but in a story of wellness, of personal wellness and spiritual wellness.
And the name, Miriam, I think you were alluding to, is sort of this combination of mayim and mar, bitter water.
Miriam, that's right. And that the bitterness and that she transforms them, whether it's from the slavery in Egypt and the oppression, through literally allowing and providing for the survival of Moshe Rabbeinu, who ultimately is going to take us out and draw us from the water. So that's Miriam, who understands the message of Mara, that you can always take that bitter situation.
And so when the water was removed after Miriam passed away, so what was the lesson for the children of Israel?
Beautiful, beautiful. So there are many commentaries who speak about how the legacy really of Miriam should be not only, don't get up and cry to Moshe and to Aaron, but rather, and by now you should know, you should be keeping commandments. That's what will allow for you to be provided with water. Or as Rav Nachman Breslov has a beautiful commentary where he talks about how when Miriam passed away, she left a vacuum basically of a morah. She left a vacuum of teaching. And they said Moshe and Aaron were supposed to fill that vacuum by speaking to the people, by becoming those teachers. And they scream in the end out of anger, Shimuna Hamorim, listen, rebels, but it could also be understood as listen, teachers, right? Just listen and make sure that you, like Miriam, you continue with your learning, you continue with your teaching. But my favorite is actually an explanation that's offered by Ibn Ezra in the name of Rav Moshe, who says that what they didn't do, they weren't punished until after they brought forth the water. So basically everything they did was right. Rather, after they brought forth the water, they didn't learn the legacy of Miriam, which is when God brings forth water, you then have to sing a song. And that's really the legacy of Miriam, to teach us not only the power of prayer, not only the power of taking care of ourselves physically, hand in hand with our spiritual survival, but it's also a lesson of gratitude. And Miriam taught us, when God gives you water, when God grants you salvation, you go out and dance, you go out and sing. And sure enough, it's the next section wherein they have water, and there it's Az Yashir Yisrael et Hashira Hazot. They finally have learned that they don't even have to wait for Moses to start the song. They've learned how to start the song on their own.
As opposed to the other Az Yashir Moshe, B'nai Israel. So, okay, very nice. So, okay, a couple of things. You mentioned prayer. I want to talk to you about prayer in a minute, but you also alluded to your methodology, and some of the other guests who've had an opportunity to speak with also mentioned their methodology. And I think that's really important because when it comes to studying Tanakh, so we don't necessarily have a very well-established methodology. It seems like it doesn't go back for the Jewish people, there's something new about the studying of Tanakh. Maybe it's connected to Israel. I'd love to hear your take on and your particular methodology that guides your study of Tanakh.
Yeah, so I love speaking about this, and I'm glad that so just as you said, I would say a more literary approach, and this is somewhat ironic, has really been, meaning we've always studied the Tanakh, we've always heard the Tanakh, as a matter of fact, and before, as you know, St. Jerome, and then by the time we have the chapters and the verses, and this is not incorporated even in our Jewish structure, in the Jewish text, until significantly later. And even the Ramban, the Nachmanides, who certainly knows these divisions and his debates with Pablo Cristiani, he won't quote, meaning he knows the chapters and verses, but in his own commentary, he doesn't incorporate them because we're so involved in the text. So people always ask, how did we used to learn Tanakh? And I would say, well, this is how a teacher would teach. You ready? And after these things, God came and he tested or he challenged our father, Abraham, and everyone would know exactly what we were referring to, because the words were just, this was part of our culture, this was part of our conversation. And as we know, over the years, and by this I mean in addition to public readings of the Torah, we also find the various midrashim, the homiletics, some that are closer, I would say, closer to a pshat, closer to a literary reading. They're always motivated by some other lesson, right? Either a historical lesson, a moral lesson that's there, filling in lacunae, right? The sages can believe that there aren't really any holes in Tanakh, that the Torah tells you everything you need to know in order to live an edified life. And therefore, whether it's filling in ambiguities and anonymous characters. So we have really I'm even going to say a precedent for literary techniques that you definitely see highlighted by the works of Midrash. But for many years, Midrash, because of the lessons, became, I would say, the more dominant form of learning, until, ironically, is really the German scholars. And at the turn of the 18th, really the 19th century, who started studying a more academic approach of the Bible. And then over time, right, the Jewish scholars said, we have, different approaches of Jewish scholars. I'm making this much more simplistic than it actually is. Someone said, let's adopt, like Mordechai Breuer, let's adopt the skills and the questions of biblical critics, and let's try to see some more theologically based answers. And this is definitely a methodology that I apply to teaching. Let's ask complicated questions, right? Doesn't the story remind you of another story? Maybe there are multiple authors, but no, we believe that there's one author. We believe that God gave this to the people of Israel, written by Moses, and therefore let's try to understand perhaps different perspectives. What Mordechai Breuer developed as Shtei Bechinot, which I definitely, again, apply to teaching. And at the same time, also to go back to that literary approach, but infuse it with the theological messages of the Midrash. So many of the Midrashim are also based on a sensitivity to the text, or again, recognizing word plays, seeing the structure without actually calling it chiasm. And there are so many proofs where you can definitely work backwards and see how this medieval commentary is definitely sensitive to the structure of the text. And this, and different commentary, dividing up the text somewhat differently, and thereby resulting in a different commentary. So I always try to work forwards. Let's start with the text. Tell everyone, just take out your Bible, right? Take out your Tanakh. And I always have them bring colored pencils to class, and so that they can highlight, whether it's leading words, resounding words, type scenes, again, different scenes that reverberate and resound, again, so that they'll hear the consonants, and then the resonances of the story, but then appreciate the dissonance in the story. And then I bring different midrashim and show how the midrashim are highlighting certain ideas within the text itself. And even within the study of midrash, you can't just say, oh, the midrash says. There are so many different sages living over hundreds of years of time, and even modern midrash, which is also phenomenal, then to be able to extrapolate, and this is really what rabbis do, when they're standing in front of a congregation, they're also, whether it's applying something that happened 2,000 years ago to today, looking back at the times of King David and seeing how he responded to pandemics and recognizing how those messages are just as relevant.
Right. And what about, though, what changed when we came back to Israel in terms of our study and appreciation of Tanakh?
Excellent. Thank you for reminding me of this. So what happened, and you see this, especially in the literature, starting, I would say, the 1950s and 1960s here, that coming back, not only did we have a greater appreciation for the land itself, for the geography of the land and the stories of the land, but the language. And all of a sudden, and Hebrew becomes our language, our primary language, which means that we can converse in this and we can understand and we can examine the text and we can go back to biblical grammar. And we can go back to these places. One of my favorite Yerushim when I take people to the city of Hebron is that Rashi, who's living in southern France, as we know in the 11th century, Rashi explains that when Jacob sent Joseph from Hebron to check on his brothers in the northern parts of Shechem, it says that he sent him from the valley of Hebron, from the valley of Hebron. And Rashi says, but wait a second, we see from all these other stories that Hebron is really a mountain. So it doesn't mean he sent him from the valley. So Rashi says it must mean that same word means a deep place, the depths of the plan of God, of a divine plan. And Nachmanides, who makes it to Israel, and who comes here, as we know, in the 1300s, Nachmanides says, no, when you go to Hebron, you can actually see what it means, because the city may be surrounded by hills, but it actually is oriented like a funnel. And there really is an Emek, there's a valley. So Jacob sends Joseph from the top of the mountain through the valley in order to leave the city. And this is just one example of what it means to be able to appreciate the stories when you come to Tanakh. I would say one of the greatest works of scholarship over the past 100 years was the Perush, the commentary known as Da'at Mikra. And then everyone should have this, any biblical scholar in their library. They're now translating many of the works into English, which was really a group of religious Torah scholars who said, wow, now we're back in the land of Israel. Now this is more relevant than ever. Now we can understand based on historical data, archaeological facts, which is fascinating. With all the archaeology, just like you said, you were in Adulam, and now that we're unearthing, whether it's different documents and clay tablets and seeing the different strata of archaeology and appreciating not only the chronology, but so many of the stories. When you go back to the city of David, and they actually found these clay tablets with Gemariyahu ben Shaphan, who's mentioned in the book of Jeremiah, and he's one of the scholars who protects Jeremiah. And then you see how basically his residence, the area of his work, was entirely burned at the time of the destruction of the first temple. All of a sudden, it helps us appreciate the stories themselves so much more, not only recognizing the veracity of so many of these stories, but ultimately helping us understand them more. And now that this is really we call this the lands of the Bible, and now it's time to study and appreciate the Bible anew. So if scholarship was once hailing from Germany, there's no question that biblical scholarship is now, I would say we're heads and shoulders above everyone else coming from the lands of Israel, which is exactly what it was meant to be.
Right, and I have to put a little plug in for the Israel Bible, because that's exactly what we're trying to do with the Israel Bible. Oh, look, there it is. So it's brings Israel to life. And especially, we're talking a lot about methodology and the sensitive reading to the words and a story that alludes to so many other things. And of course, the non-Jewish world, and there's so many non-Jews who read the Israel Bible really get so much out of it, because we really try to have, by having the Hebrew next to the English with lessons that connect to the Hebrew that you don't get when you read the Bible in translation. You really miss so much of the deeper meaning and connections between one story and another story. So hopefully more people will start learning Hebrew and more people will start really trying to see how Israel comes to life in the Bible. And we know that that's happening. If we have time for just one more topic, because we mentioned prayer, and you mentioned that when it comes to the book of Leviticus, right? The book of Leviticus. So for most people, it's kind of like lost on them. It's about the priests, and they don't really know what it's talking about, and animal sacrifice. And it's like a lot of people almost, either they skip it or they read it kind of on a superficial level. But there are a lot of messages and lessons for us, especially when it comes to connecting with God. And we don't have animal sacrifices today, but we do have other ways of connecting with God, namely through prayer. So how do you understand the message for us today when it comes to prayer through the book of Leviticus?
Very nice. So I think first, just as you asked about the methodology, we always go back to the text, go back to the verses, and appreciate that the introduction to the book of Leviticus is really a continuation, as we know, of the end of Exodus, wherein God had told the people, okay, you just experienced this major sound and light show by Mount Sinai. You experienced divine revelation. And I always imagine to myself, can you imagine the people of Israel the very next morning opening up the windows, so to speak, of their tents and seeing the same mountain that just the day before had thunder, lightning, and a heavenly cloud, and all of a sudden now it is barren. And that experience is all but ephemeral. And God comes to Moses right after and says, no, you're going to basically preserve, you're going to create a microcosm of that revelation in your midst through the sanctuary. You're going to, now that you see that God's transcendence can actually be imminent in this world, you're going to create almost that mini Mount Sinai. So the same word of God that was at the top of the mountain is going to be in the Holy of Holies through the Ark of Covenant. The same fire that you had there is going to be manifest through the fire of the menorah, of the great candelabra. The same panim el panim, the same face-to-face relationship is now going to be manifest through the actual table of the showbreads that are called showbreads because God's face was shown. And the same altar that was built by the people on the foot of the mountain, that's also going to be perpetuated through the primary altar on the outskirts or in the courtyard of this tabernacle. And what we're supposed to realize is that as opposed to all pagan religions during that time that also had their own sanctuaries, they had their own temples, but it was set aside for the priests. The book of Leviticus begins with Adam ki yakriv, each and every one of you, and sacrificial worship, and for that matter, getting close. The word yakriv, korban, means to develop a close relationship with God. God says it's open to every single person. I want every single person to get close to me. And it's true that it begins with coming to a place. And the reason is because if we go back even to the book of Genesis, we see that the first time this term of holiness appears is in the context of the dimension of time. God sanctifies, God makes the seventh day, following 6 active days of creation, he makes the 7th day holy. And we don't really know what that means. Just like Moses doesn't know really what it means that when God says, okay, take off your sandals because this place is holy. All we know is that God is the source of holiness and we respond to it. So God creates holiness of time, God creates holiness of space. And then we're told at the time of the covenant of Sinai, we're told that God also creates holiness of people, that we're going to be a mamlechet kohanim, literally an entire kingdom of priests, the goy kadosh, and a nation that is going to be sanctified, that is going to be holy. And we don't really know what this means. And God says, that's okay, you shouldn't know what it means. This is a godly term. But because we're physically oriented people, God says, so create a mikdash, create a sanctuary, literally a domain of sanctity. And that's how you're going to learn how to create this relationship with God. And at the beginning, really, the first 17 chapters of the book of Leviticus are all about how we're going to recognize, how we're going to follow these divine mandates of God, what God defines as pure and impure, the limitations of going to the sanctuary versus the availability of going to the sanctuary. We learn about the dynamic aspects of relationship with God based on God's terms. And that's really so much of what holiness is all about, recognizing if I want a relationship with God, it's not going to be on my terms. Like we know from the story of Aaron's 2 children, of Nadav and Avihu, who at the time that God manifests himself in the form of fire in a symbiotic manner, they just want to respond in the form of fire, and God says, no, that's not what I asked for, and you have to follow mandates. And this seems to be very robotic. But in fact, you have to go on in the book of Leviticus, because then the ensuing chapters talk about how we can also be holy people, even beyond the sanctuary, beyond just this particular place. We can be sanctified through our choices of behavior, through respecting our parents, through leaving corners off of our fields, through showing respect really to elders, through not cursing even deaf people. These are ways in which we define and basically qualify ourselves through godly behaviors that ultimately make us holy. Now, what in the world does this have to do with prayer? Well, we see that the second half of Leviticus talks about how we have the ability then to also sanctify time. God says, now that you understand a relationship with holiness a little more, go ahead and you sanctify the time of the festivals. And you know what? You can also sanctify place. It's not just the sanctuary. Go and sanctify the land of Israel. And you know what? In speaking about the sanctification of man, you sanctify yourselves through behavior. And therefore, if we don't have the, I would say, the most physical means of relating to God in this somewhat tangible way by bringing a sacrifice and learning the sacrifices. And that's why it's so important not to skip Leviticus, and not even to skip the first 7 chapters of Leviticus that, yes, are really the most concentrated chapters of sacrifices. The rest of the book talks more about holiness than sacrifices. But you look and you see that every sacrifice is a different expression of my relationship with God. I bring an olah, right? That's as it's known, the sacrifice that is all consumed by God to show my devotion to God, my vulnerability before God. I bring a flour offering, a mincha, to show that God sustains me with nourishment. I bring a shlamim, a peace offering, when I want to express gratitude towards God. And I basically bring as many of my neighbors and all people, from society to join in that celebration. And there are times, those are obviously the voluntary expressions, and there are times that I'm obligated to bring what are called the sin and the guilt offerings. But when you learn them carefully, you see that it's not really sin in the, I would say, conventional iniquity manner. Rather, it's more mistakes that we make, or negligence, or the guilt, which is really because we're not conscious or mindful of our actions. And therefore, these sacrifices, really all of them, help us appreciate what expressions to God are all about. And it would be nice, I truly believe, if we had some physical means, if we had this really physical love language to God, to be able to offer to him. In the meantime, though, we're supposed to be thinking about these ideas. I hope that every morning we get up and think. I always tell my students, okay, try to think to yourselves, what type of carbon mood are you in? If you were going to Jerusalem today, to the temple, which of the sacrifices would you be bringing? And are you in a gratitude mood? Are you in a vulnerable state? Do you feel a sense of contrition right now? And do you want to thank God for sustenance? Thank God for your basic health today? And are you celebrating your child's wedding, and you would bring the karban shlamim? And it just makes us so much more conscious of different expressions to God. And that's really what tefillah is. What people forget is that tefillah, prayer, doesn't just replace, it's not merely there to replace sacrifices. We had prayer all along, again, going back to the times of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. But this conventional prayer is coming to remind us that, wait a second, we really have an opportunity to relate to God, to relate to the holiness of God. And that's why there is significance in praying in a particular building, in the synagogue, in the Beit Knesset, which is called a mini tabernacle, in the words of the prophets. That we're meant to still see ourselves as standing before God. And the fact that even without that tangible intermediary, we can still verbalize our thoughts, our feelings, our consciousness to God is I would say, such a powerful and essential medium of what our relationship with God really is. And that's why prayer is a way of perpetuating holiness in the, I would say, very amorphous term. It's a way of ensuring that we still understand that we have the ability to, and I would say the opportunity to truly recognize what a relationship with the divine is. It is great and as transcendent as God is. God is also immanent in this world. And different expressions of prayer then still expressing the ideas of these sacrifices, whether they be gratitude, whether they be praise, whether they be our sense of vulnerability and so many petitions to God.
So you describe like a balance between a certain kind of fixed, rigid system, but also flexible and spontaneous.
You got it. That's exactly what it is. And it's so fascinating that even within the sacrifices, God says, you're in an Ola mood, excellent. You have to bring a male animal, but you have some choices there. You're in a mincha mood, a flour offering. You can bring it if you want as a pita. You can bring it as a donut. You can bring it as a pancake, meaning there's latitude even within that. And it's remarkable also that these are all voluntary, and then we have the obligatory. And that's our relationship with God. God says, look, I do determine and how you're going to relate to me, but there's so much flexibility there. And therefore, there are, just as you said, a fixed schedule of when we have to pray to God. But within that, we can, as we know in certain blessings of the Amidah, of literally standing before God, recognizing that presence and relationship before God, then we also have that latitude. We can speak whatever is on our minds. It becomes a catharsis. It becomes a wonderful time for self-reflection. It becomes a wonderful time for reflecting on my relationship with God and ultimately strengthening my relationship with God. I say it's, today with smartphones and, klita, when you have this good reception and bad reception, I said, we always have reception with God, and we have prayer.
Mm-hmm. And just to tie it back to Israel, because God could have set a system where you could pray to Him wherever you want, and a lot of, I think that even resonates with especially a modern kind of sensibility, is like, why do I need to go to a certain place to pray? But God did set it up that way, that you would have these certain structures, but also a certain land, a certain place where our relationship with God is more manifest.
That's exactly it. And just as sometimes in the time of the temple, and the sages bluntly state that, and even when Solomon, as we know, is inaugurating the temple, he's not dismissing that you shouldn't pray, in your backyards. He says there's something special about coming to this place. This is the stairway to heaven. And this is where you're going to come to pray when it comes to rain. This is where you're going to come to pray for political issues and military threats. This is where all the nations of the world are going to come to pray, which is such a strange concept, as you said today, that, wait a second, don't we believe that God is everywhere? We believe godliness is everywhere, and we believe that God is transcendent. But God Himself said there are going to be places and that in which His presence is going to be more imminent. And therefore, I don't know about you, but I would want to be closer to that place. And we believe that if we don't have the temple, then still Jerusalem and the surrounding areas then also has the next level of Kedusha, the next level of holiness, of this intense closeness with God, which means that, the prayers in Jerusalem then have a more direct line, so to speak, up to heaven, and then the prayers throughout the lands of Israel. And then, yes, prayers in the diaspora also count, and they also strengthen our relationship with God. I'm going to share with you that every time I'm lecturing abroad and I get to the blessing in the prayer service of the Techazena Einenu B'Shuvcha L'Tzion B'Rachamim, God, please let us envision your return to Zion. And I can't help it, but I cry because I say, thank God, we merit the return to Zion today. And as we say this, and to think that, then I always hit myself, so what am I doing? I'm praying and outside of the land of Israel, only to be reminded that we want that next level of closeness. Thank God we have Jerusalem. Thank God we have the land of Israel. And yes, there is a special, the immanence of God, the closeness with God, the holiness with God manifests in so many ways through so many different laws as well, through so many verses throughout the Bible. And we can quote literally hundreds and thousands of verses of the Bible to highlight this idea of God's closeness to the land of Israel. And we still hope for that intense manner, as Solomon said, of being able to return to the temple, which will enable our prayers to have an even, I would say, even greater direct line.
This was such a great conversation. Thank you very much for your time and for your ideas and for sharing. If people want more classes from you, or if they want to read more of your articles, because you pack so much in, so how do they do that?
So firstly, you can feel free, to send out my email, any topic. I usually have, and thank God, hundreds of source material and source sheets. And also, as you said at the beginning, as a teacher, I just love teaching. So thank God there are a lot of both Zoom lectures available, but also on various sites. The Matan, the Advanced Torah Studies for Women website, has many lectures archived. YU, Yeshiva University, OU, the Orthodox Union, where I basically also run the program for learning all of the works of the prophets. And let's say various.
We will put those links in the area below so that people could stay in touch with you or to listen to become your student virtually. And thank you so much for sharing these exciting and important ideas from Tanakh with us today.
Thank you. Really a pleasure. And just as you said, we could go on for hours. So hopefully we'll have more opportunities.